Energy Transition, episode number 48. Our topic today is Windfall Profits by Big Oil Companies. Great to see you, Irina Slav, Tammy Nimet, David Blackmon. Good morning.
Hello.
Hello.
Uh-huh. Let me please share screen. $200 billion. This is the combined profit of the oil majors in 2022. It's a very big number, no?
A lot of
And
money.
yeah, a lot of money. And David, please, let's start with you. Is there a correlation between the high profits of oil companies and fuel price for the society?
Oh, sure. Yes. Obviously, yeah. Companies always in the industry always do better when the price for oil and natural gas is high. And of course, gasoline prices and utility bills, tend to follow the prices of those commodities up and down. And even though they're traded on different markets. Um, And so, last year, oil prices were very strong throughout the year, and natural gas prices perhaps even stronger. And so companies made a lot of profits, reinvested a lot of those profits in projects, and then reinvested or planned to reinvest most of the rest of it in buying back their own stock to improve returns to their shareholders. And that, of course, is whenever oil company, Apple has done about $200 billion in stock buybacks over the last 5 years, and nobody in the Democratic Party uttered a peep. But when an oil company does it, it's like the world is going to end. And so they're taking a lot of heat for those plans today. And that's just the way it goes if you're part of big oil.
Irina, do you think that the government would or should interfere in these profits?
I'm sure they would like to. They already interfered with windfall profit taxes. And I actually read a very interesting column in Bloomberg today, suggesting that they might want to try and get a bigger chunk of these profits in the form of windfall profit taxes. So I don't know if they can come up with another way, which is hilarious because at the same time they want governments in Europe and the Biden administration, at least, they want oil companies to produce more oil. But the oil companies have said very plainly, very understandably, that if they're being taxed additionally and they're being interfered with, they will not invest in more production. And if they're being discouraged to invest in more production by green transition plans too, they have zero motivation to do that. And they are not doing that. They are buying back their own stock.
Yeah, interesting. Tell me, what would be reasonable to have as profits for big oil companies?
I don't think that's an appropriate question that an individual can answer, right? I mean, and that's the issue here, where you have governments who are trying to make a determination about what is a reasonable profit, what is defined as excess. And so if you're going to do that to oil and gas, then, they should apply that across the board. But if they are truly a capitalist system, they shouldn't be doing it at all. That's not their job. It's not their job to decide how much profit a company gets to have. And what I found interesting about the first article you put up there is that there's this conflation between earnings and profit.
Yeah.
So and they're like pre-tax profit. Well, if it's pre-tax, it's not profit. It's earnings, and then you have to pay off all this other stuff. So I find that a bit disingenuous to keep throwing that out there where they're using the earnings number as being profit. And I agree completely with what Irina and David said about, the governments are throwing up every possible roadblock for oil and gas companies to do their job and then complain that they're not producing enough. But the governments are establishing these policies to prevent that type of investment. And I'll just give you a really quick example in Canada. So the environment minister was complaining that the oil sands companies have all this money and they say they're going to decarbonize. So why aren't they throwing that money into decarbonization right away? the thing is the approvals for any of that stuff, including decarbonization, if it's carbon capture, utilization and storage, creating CO2 pipelines, all of that requires government approval, which takes forever.
Yeah.
Even when it's a green project, it takes forever. So it's like they want this oversight, but they want the investment now. Well, how is that going to work?
You know, we have a great example of that today. ExxonMobil, I just wrote a story about it, is announcing today, you know, progress on this huge hydrogen production hub they're creating at the Baytown refinery. And if you read their release carefully, they talk about, you know, making a final investment decision in the 24-25 timeframe, but it's dependent on exactly what you talked about, Tammy, getting the government approvals, the permits in place from the EPA and from the state, and you know, from all these different regulatory agencies to actually build the equipment to make the hydrogen. And in this administration, those permits are painfully slow to come, and intentionally so.
Yep.
And so, you know, maybe they'll be able to make that final investment decision then, and maybe they won't, but that's what you have to deal with.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
And it's then you have to consult with the stakeholders, right? So then you get all these stakeholders who suddenly want to have a say, and then the process is just interminable.
Yeah.
That's
And
right.
I'm all for stakeholders having a say, but it all takes time. Tom Kirkman makes a great point here. Oil profits are apparently bad, but governments are addicted to oil taxes. It's an oil sin tax. It's kind of hard to argue that point, isn't it? I mean, we don't ever, I wouldn't actually, you know, just as a matter of concept, I'm not sure I'd have a big problem with the concept of a windfall profit tax if the government in 2020 would have also talked about enacting a windfall losses refund when all the companies were going bankrupt, right?
Yeah, when we were in negative oil prices, right? And where was government assistance for that?
Right.
Or what about big tech and all the profits they made during the pandemic?
Oh,
Yeah, that's right. Increase.
Well, they did talk about that. I was looking that up to see if there was a comparison. And governments talked about maybe having an excess COVID tax or something on these companies, but they just talked. They didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So at least what I could find. So it's, they talk. But with the oil companies, they do, unfortunately.
No actions in reality.
Yeah.
But Tammy, please, with the expected increase of world consumption of oil for the next years, the prediction is to reach 104 million barrels a day. Today, David, I suppose is 400 million barrels a day. So with this growth of consumption, what's the investment and profit equation for big oil companies? What could be in their minds to this challenge?
That's a really good question. And I don't envy being an oil and gas executive these days. I mean, there's so many different variables that they have to consider. They have to look at what are the governments going to do? And that's the big equation, not necessarily what demand is, but all of these different bans, these mandates, all of the different roadblocks in regulatory administration. So I think it's very difficult for companies to plan ahead. And like when you get to the EU saying they're going to ban the internal combustion engine, and same with Canada, and same with California, and various jurisdictions in the United States, and we think, oh well, that's a ways away. It's not going to happen, but it's 2035, and auto companies have to make decisions about their assembly lines, purchasing, long-term things, and so on. So once they start down that path to stop the manufacturing, it becomes very difficult to have that come back again. And so if there's no cars to use the oil, the refined oil, then what does that mean? And then that can create a problem. So I think it's very difficult for oil and gas companies to make those decisions.
Yeah, and the same thing applies to a refinery, right? I mean, you can't. How could any company Exxon a couple of months ago announced a major expansion, or they're about, I think, to finish a major expansion in their Beaumont refinery. They've indicated that, and but that's not a new refinery. How could a company justify a decision to invest 10, $15 billion in building a new refinery when they know, number one, that it would take 10 to 15 years from the time you identify a site for it until maybe the time you have your permits in place and can start building it, right? And you have Jennifer Granholm and other officials in the Biden administration consistently repeating this mantra that they want to shut refining business in America down in 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's a real damper on capital investment in this country and in this kind of infrastructure. And, these companies are profitable. And so part of that big profit now is that suddenly they have a new infusion of capital that they would be able to invest in new projects here in the United States and around the world. But because the regulatory and legal environment has become so uncertain in this administration, most of that investment money is going to go to other countries like Guyana and the west coast of Africa and other countries who want that investment in their economies.
Mm-hmm. Irina, please, John Cassiano is asking us about the small independent oil companies. What do you see in this case?
Investors in small independent oil companies have to consider this all too. Another obstacle to getting more oil and gas into the market. Yes, to me, government's behavior right now looks like self-sabotage at every step. I mean, they keep pushing this energy transition agenda, but they are also forced by reality to admit that we still need fossil fuels. But they want to phase out these fossil fuels before too long. But they admit we still need them. But they want to have to do away with them in like 10 years with all these internal combustion engine bans and, the build out of wind and solar. And as David and Tammy have pointed out, the permitting process for more oil and gas production, which is needed right now, is not getting easier. So they want the oil and gas right now. They don't want it in 10 years, but they want it now. But they're making it as hard as possible to, bring more oil and gas online. It's a ridiculous situation, to be honest. And I'm sure that oil and gas companies are perfectly aware that we will continue needing about the same, if not more, oil and gas in 10 years than we need now. But their hands are kind of tied because governments have proven that they are willing and ready to step in and prevent them from boosting production and ensuring the longer term supply of oil and gas. Yeah. So why bother? Better be cautious and, keep production relatively flat.
At the same time, David, oil companies are making the movement to the renewables investments. So how they deal with these two mindsets?
Well, you have to, it just becomes a little more complex to manage your business. At companies like Shell and BP, they've been doing that for a couple of decades anyway. And so they've been in the renewable business. For example, I toured a facility close to my home last week, a solar farm that in which BP is a partner. And, it's a pretty cool installation, and they've been doing it for a long time. For a company like ExxonMobil, it's part of the reason that very dynamic is part of the reason why you see ExxonMobil putting such a strong emphasis not on getting into wind and solar power, but into carbon capture and sequestration, this $100 billion project they're mounting along the Houston Ship Channel to capture and sequester carbon. And now in this hydrogen hub at the Baytown refinery, these are things that Exxon as a company already has the expertise on staff to deal with. It's the same kinds of engineers and geoscientists and chemists that the company already has on staff in its downstream businesses and upstream businesses. That is the exact kind of expertise you need to mount those kinds of projects. So it makes a lot of sense for them as a company to move in that direction. And Chevron is in a similar position to Exxon, really. So when you look at the big companies, you're going to see a very distinct difference in how they move. Each company moves to lower its carbon footprint. Last point, Shell and BP have as one of their objectives to dramatically reduce their oil production as part of their efforts to become, meet their net zero goals. Exxon and Chevron don't share that goal. Okay. They're oil companies and they're going to continue to be oil companies, while at the same time working in other directions to lower their emissions footprints. And it all makes sense from internal management standpoint. And it's really been an interesting thing to follow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Imperial Oil in Canada just announced a new biodiesel refinery that they're going to be constructing, which will be $1 billion or whatever, where they're going to process oil seeds into biodiesel. So this is their attempt to do the net zero, right? Because they're being promised that if they contribute to these different efforts, they'll be allowed to continue to survive. But where it gets fuzzy is in the Scope 3 emissions accounting. So because Scope 3 is the combustion of that oil and gas. And so they'll invest this money under the promise of net zero, but then it'll come down to say, well, I'm glad that you were able to get net zero on your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but Scope 3 is 80%. And sorry, you don't qualify anymore for the net zero. So I find it difficult for the companies in the sense of they're trying to accommodate the government's policy proposals with net zero. They don't want to be seen as the bad guy. But as Irina pointed out, there's so many contradictions in all of this that it's, all they can really do is throw up their hands up and be like, okay, so what's the government going to be pledging today,
Right.
Irina, in Brazil, the country uses 12% of biodiesel in diesel and 27% of ethanol in gasoline. It's an impressive
you
number.
have the land to grow the plants to
Yeah.
produce this.
Exactly.
Not all countries have. But I was surprised to hear that the European Union also has rather ambitious plans with regard to biodiesel and biofuels in general. I'm wondering, where are they going to grow the crops? Not that anybody is telling me, but Tammy made an excellent point about Scope 3 emissions. However, I look at it, I'm not a specialist, I'm not an auditor, I'm not an emission tracker, but I've been racking my brain to find a way that Scope 3 emissions can be tracked to begin with, let alone mitigated in any way. And I can't seem to find a way. I will be very grateful if any of you have an idea, how you can track Scope 3 emissions. I mean, just think about the super majors that don't just produce the oil and refine it, but they sell it across, petrol stations across the world.
Yeah.
How do you track the emissions that all this petrol, all this diesel generates from the
Don't look at me. I
consumers?
think it's an absurd concept to begin
Yes.
with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
that's right.
impossible.
Possible. Grand Final is always just an hour a weekly meetings. Please, David, for you.
Grand finale. Thank you for joining in. Can we be honest here and just accept the fact that this attack on fossil fuels is squarely aimed at destroying capitalism, making us all dependent on our governments? I don't see anything to argue with in that statement. I think ultimately that's the goal. That's the goal of all of this. And, they're right on track to doing it to us.
Yeah, that's right. Tell me, with these huge profits and that it can have some kind of influence in the energy transition industrial policy. I mean, the trends in the renewables policy.
Well, so this is the big thing, right? Where you have the Western government saying to the oil and gas companies that whatever excess money you make that we decide you shouldn't have, we're going to tax it and then reinvest it into whatever our decarbonization, renewable energy plans are to support the energy transition, which is basically, as Grand Finale pointed out, it's no longer that you as a company know the best way to spend your money. It's not that people know the best way to spend their own money. Governments know best on how to spend that money, and which is the EU industrial policy that Ursula von der Leyen talked about at the WEF conference in Davos, where they're going to be deciding who gets to be the winners and losers in the energy transition. I really like this company, they're going to get lots of money, or we're going to do this tech thing, and so on and so forth. And how does that, that's not how a capitalist society is supposed to work, which then begs the question, are we still a capitalist society when governments are doing these kinds of industrial policies and trying to decide and micromanage how the economy is going to function?
Yeah, they're trying a centrally planned economy. I can't believe they are doing this when there's a relatively fresh example of how it went for Eastern Europe and former Soviet bloc. I mean, there is evidence it does not work over a longer term. And yet they're trying. They're like children, we're going to try it because we are going to do it differently and we're going to succeed because
Right.
it's us doing it.
Which is why they're still making the same mistakes from the 70s with their high interest rates and, how they responded in the 70s to the energy crisis. They're doing the exact same thing now. It didn't work then. Why are they doing it now? And as you say, it's like, well, we can do it better now.
Right. And expecting different answers, different responses.
Yeah, a different outcome to the same thing. Like
that is the definition of insanity, right? I mean, that's yeah. Hey, can I just share one anecdote about the windfall profit tax? Because I'm old, and I came into the industry 3 months before Jimmy Carter signed the original windfall profit tax into law in 1980. And unfortunately, I was an accountant and the low man on the totem pole, so I was assigned the task of figuring that thing all out for the Coastal Corporation, Oscar Wilde at the time. And what was so ironic about that law, and I suspect would probably happen again today if Congress in the United States really moved to do it, is that law was structured in a way that pretty much eliminated any real liability from the major oil companies under the windfall profit tax. The people most impacted by the windfall profit tax, the original windfall profit tax in the United States, were royalty owners and independent producers, and the majors paid almost nothing into that tax.
Right.
And within 5 years, the industry went into a big bust, and the tax was collecting nothing anyway because it's a boom and bust industry and always will be. Yeah. And so, Congress history on this kind of thing is awful. And the thought that, well, it just goes back to this theme. Well, we know better now. We're going to do it right. No, that's not going to happen in Congress. Yeah. Nothing has changed in the way we make laws in Washington, D.C. So the thought that you're really going to punish the major oil companies with a windfall profit tax is probably silly to begin with.
Well, David, I'd like to add an anecdote as well. In Canada in the 70s, they said they could make all the planning they wanted because they had all these econometric analyses. They had all these computers running models and everything else, and they were going to be able to adapt the different price differentials because the pricing system in Canada at that time was insane. And I get the same sense of it now, where they're like, we've got all of these great computer models, and they're going to tell us where we should invest and how this is going to work and the energy transition and all this kinds of stuff. And then when it comes to reality, then this is where we get the contradictions, because reality hits and it realizes that, those models and that planning doesn't work, at least the way they think it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. William Miller.
Peak oil. Oh my God! Don't get me started on that. We need another half hour. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Anybody else want to take that one?
Yeah, that's right.
So
Peak
peak
oil
oil
supply
and
or peak oil demand.
Yeah, big
yeah,
argument.
yeah.
Yeah. And John,
What about the next
next generation?
generation? How can they be optimistic about fossil fuels with constant bombardment of ridiculous policies?
Keep thinking. That's what I can advise the next generation. Keep using your own brains
Yeah,
instead of
use your own.
believing government policies and computer models,
Yeah,
which
that's
are
right.
made by humans with their biases.
But
Right.
people, do you believe or do you expect that the governments can apply new tax or new penalties, fines, or I don't know how we can call this, unexpected taxes? This can be for these huge profits.
I wouldn't be surprised if they do it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they tried. I would be shocked if it was a success in any real way. Of
Well,
course,
it's like they're doing these price caps. And so I
Mm.
think they believe if they do price caps, then they don't have to institute as heavy or as big windfall taxes because that sounds bad, maybe. I don't know. But like with this, the diesel cap or the products cap from Russian um, oil and diesel and products, whatever that's coming up on February 5th, the EU is still negotiating some kind of price cap because they know that the minute they cut that off, well, what's going to happen? You've just taken out that diesel from the world market. What's going to happen to the price, right? It's going to skyrocket. And they're like, well, how can we contain that? You know, I'm like, the governments create this mess and then they want to punish companies that benefit from these stupid government policies that maybe they shouldn't be doing in the first place.
Yeah, they're acting first and thinking later. That's the biggest problem. We
Good
have
point.
infantile politicians. Young children
Yeah.
because they're young children.
oh, this is a great point made by Grand
Mm.
Finale here. The goal of windfall profit taxes is not actual wealth redistribution, but to appease voters and make them feel good. And that's
My God. Yeah.
true.
I think it's all of the above, to be honest. I think
Mm.
it's appeasing the voters. It's for them, it's like a win-win. They get to appease the voters, they get to feel good, and they get to decide where that money gets spent. That otherwise the companies would have be investing where they want. So now they can take that money, pay off voters, then build up renewables and give it to the people that they want. So
But
I
it
think it's
won't
all of it.
last, would it? I mean, you can't keep taxing them to death. They'll
No,
just
so
start producing less and less, and prices will go up once again. And, voters lose again.
Yeah.
Well, but the politicians have a great solution to that. When the price goes up, they demonize big oil for conspiring to make the price go up.
Let's
Right?
go
That
up.
wouldn't help
Exactly.
drivers, when their bill at the petrol station is like twice what it
Station.
was a year earlier.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
But we're all
Yeah.
supposed to live in 15-minute cities where we
Right.
don't need to get
Yes.
around.
Yes.
So,
William,
Bicycles for
prevent
everyone.
investment, create uncertainty around capital planning. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what
But
they've succeeded in doing. Yes.
And they
right.
have.
And only in the West, though, because look at China, look at India, look at
Right.
Turkey. Look at these other areas of the world where they're not doing this kind of thing. So you have to ask yourself, is this a suicide pact in the West
Right.
to see our demise? I don't know.
Well, it feels that way, doesn't it? I mean, it really is. These policies are really coming from the West, from Europe, the United States, Canada mainly. And the rest of the world is looking at us thinking, you people are nuts. We want to actually be able to cook food and keep our populations warm during the winter. And to do that, we need fossil fuels. And so, it just has created this dichotomy, this global dichotomy where the West is bankrupting itself over pursuit of these climate goals. And China and India and rest of Asia and Africa are just mainly working to find ways to secure their own national energy security. And this can't continue for a whole lot longer before we have a real economic reckoning in the West.
And do we have a
Good point.
scheduled meeting for OPEC next week or this week? I'm not
This
sure.
week.
this week.
Yeah.
And
Thursday.
we expect that they keep the same.
That's what everyone is saying, that there won't be any surprises there.
So the profits may be the same.
For now.
Well, yeah, if these price levels for oil continue, it'll be a profitable year for companies that are heavy in oil. Natural gas prices have collapsed in the United States, so independent producers that are heavy on natural gas are going to suffer this year because I don't really see much prospect of them going back up again. So, we had a real freakish year where gas prices are concerned last year, mainly because of Russia's war with Ukraine.
The problem is that the renewables don't have profit enough yet. No,
We don't talk about this. We just talked about. It's politically
You're supposed to
incorrect.
believe the hype and then
Yeah.
move all your investment money from petroleum companies to renewable companies.
exactly.
Cheap renewables and big profits. How this
Yeah.
squares, I don't know, but
Subsidy farming, I guess.
So
yeah,
Yes.
that's
That's
exactly what it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Great conversation today. Thank you so much. It was an enormous pleasure for me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
for
It's very
organizing.
educational.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good
See you
day.
next
Bye bye.
week.
Next
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.